Our next session is Values in Foreign Policy. Krishnan Srinivasan discusses his book with Sugata Bose and Hari Vasudevan. Krishnan Srinivasan was a diplomat serving as ambassador in Libya, Zambia, Nigeria, Netherlands, and Bangladesh before appointments as Secretary, Foreign Secretary, and Commonwealth Deputy Secretary General. After retirement, he was a visiting fellow at Cambridge, Leiden, and Uppsala, apart from academic positions in India. He is the author of books on international relations and a regular columnist and book reviewer for national newspapers. Sugata Bose is the Gardner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University and has served as Director of Graduate Studies in History at Harvard and as the founding director of Harvard South Asia Institute. Hari Vasudevan is a specialist in Russian and European history and Indo-Russian relations and a UGC Emeritus Professor at the Department of History, University of Calcutta. He is a former member of the Indian Council of Historical Research, and his research interests are in the following areas: democracy and development in India and Europe, global politics of Soviet communism, Indo-Russian relations, and contemporary world politics. If I may please request our very distinguished panelists to come up on stage. Dr. Krishnan Srinivasan, Dr. Sugata Bose, and Dr. Hari Vasudevan. Welcome, sirs. I'm going to make another quick announcement before we start the panel. It's no use waiting here for signatures, sirs. Please, if you can head to the festival bookstore.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much indeed for being here. I know that you've shared a part of your Saturday morning with us, and I think you deserve great sympathy and praise for that, and we're very, very grateful. I'm also very privileged to share this platform with two most distinguished public intellectuals, Professor Sugata Bose and Professor Hari Vasudevan. And I must say that on a Saturday morning, you might find that the question of values and foreign policy is a bit heavy going, but we'll try and make it as light and as accessible as possible. And I suppose we could consider ourselves very lucky that we are sandwiched between Mr. Ruskin Bond and Mr. Amitabh Ghosh. So that's a bonus for everybody. I'd like to begin perhaps by saying just a few words about the book, and then we'll hear much more from Sugata and Hari. As far as the book is concerned, it came out some 9 months ago abroad, and it was republished in India 3 or so months ago. And it is, according to some people, the first ever narrative of the values and interests of important countries in the world. So we've covered about 12 countries in this process, from the USA in the west to Japan in our east, and we've tried to examine how the balance of values and interests plays out in each of these countries. As you know, Palmerston, the Prime Minister of Britain, in the middle of the 19th century said, "We have no permanent friends, we have no permanent enemies, we have only permanent interests." But I'm sure my colleagues on the stage will agree with me that that is not the full story, because there's the question of values also. And it's very important, I think, for us to know what the values of a particular country are, when we seek to understand um, what they do and what they don't do. And so we tried to go into this in the book in some considerable detail. Now, for small and weak countries, it's really quite easy for them to have a value system. Their value system basically is to survive. And that is not so for big and important players in world politics. Most of the important countries in the world profess a certain value system, a certain ethical basis on which they act. And the difficulty, of course, is for this to be implemented is that it runs across the problems of contingencies, circumstances, the realities of international politics, and, of course, the values of other countries, which may not be congruent with the values of your own. But every country, I think, every important country tries to look back into the past to look for the foundations of its value system. If we take the United States, for example, they go back to the founding fathers. The Declaration of Independence begins by saying we hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident seems to suggest that these are universal truths and universal values that need to be protected and projected. In Europe, who also speak a very great deal about values, they go back also a long way to the Magna Carta, to Cromwell's revolution, to the French Revolution, the uprisings of 1948. So they have a basis of historical foundation to promote a value system, which they also consider to be universal. Now, the rest of the world give far less publicity or trumpet. They give far less prominence to values. So is this a case of the West versus the rest? And this is an important question which we will be considering today. There are reasons, I think, the book goes into that, for why the rest of the world do not actually trumpet their values that much. Some of these reasons are colonialism, of course, the fact that colonialism was an aberration of the values promoted by the West. There's the question of the individual in contrast to the state and society. Western values tended to be oriented towards emancipative liberalism, that is to say, with emphasis on the individual, whereas the rest tended to give equal, if not more, importance to state sovereignty and societal values. And then there's the question of secularism. Secularism, not as we use it in India, but secularism in terms of a clear distinction between state policy and religion. In the West, religion has been kept completely to one side and has really nothing to do with state policy, whereas in the rest, they've found their inspiration from deep philosophical, religious, theological foundations. So this is a big difference as well. And lastly, there's the question of modernity. From this city, we had Partha Chatterjee, who said in a very convincing way that Asians are never architects of modernity, they're only the recipients of modernity. And so we have the distinction between a pre-modern Rest and a post-modern West. And these are really fairly fundamental differences. So anyway, that's more or less what the book contains in a kind of snapshot. But I'd like now to ask Sugata, who has a great experience of USA, where he's still an eminent professor. Sugata, under President Trump, we have a strong assertion of America first. Is this a value that goes way back to the founding fathers in America, or is it a new phenomenon that's going to perhaps be an American value for the future?
what Trump is doing at the level of both domestic policy and foreign policy is a very new phenomenon. It certainly does not go back to the era of the founding fathers of the United States of America. Now, any country fighting for independence must engage with international affairs. And in the case of late 18th century America, those who wanted to break away from Britain naturally forged relationships with France in the era of the Enlightenment. Now, the French ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity figure nowhere in Trump's conception of world affairs. He is essentially a businessman, and the word that he likes to use is transactional. I will do something for you only if you do something for me. And that's the basis on which he is being impeached today. He told the Ukrainian president that, start negotiations against my political rival, Joe Biden, and you will get some military aid to resist Russian aggression. Also, Trump seems to have a great fondness for dictators. Just consider the love letters, his word, that he likes to exchange with the North Korean ruler, Kim. Also, I see in the foreword to your book, written by Robert Kaplan, that he says foreign policy is often an extension of a country's domestic condition. Trump has taken that to extreme lengths. He seems to be obsessed with trying to overturn every legacy of his immediate predecessor, Barack Obama. And that's why he has withdrawn the United States from the very enlightened, far-sighted the nuclear deal that the United States and the European powers had reached with Iran. And this has been utterly irresponsible, and professionals in the US State Department are dismayed with what Trump has done in that area, and they are also are lamenting the fact that the State Department is being destroyed under Trump's presidency. So that would, in short, be my answer to your question about Donald Trump. I just want to add in a more general sense that, of course, there's always some kind of a fine balance that has to be struck between values and interests, between principles and power in the formulation of foreign policy. But I would like to mention that, Asians have never simply thought about cultural defense. The most enlightened of our thinkers simply wanted to question Europe's or the West's monopoly on universalism. And they wanted to say that, we also want to contribute to the shaping of a global future. And so, we want to offer our version of universalism with a difference. Now, that is not a defense of Asian values in the sense that the Singaporeans, articulated that concept in the 1990s, because that was simply inverting what the Europeans had claimed before, that Asia is the fount of all virtue. But there were rather more sophisticated thinkers and leaders of our independence struggle, or poet-philosophers like Tagore, who believed that we can think of a interconnected, interreferential Asia that might have something very creative to offer in terms of thinking of a new ethical conception in international affairs.
Yes, that's absolutely right. But may I just come back to Mr. Trump for a moment before we leave him from this discussion? Robert Kaplan, who you mentioned, has also said in his foreword to this book that if America ceases to promote free trade and democracy across the world, then it will cease to be a major power. Do you think this is what is happening now?
You know, however powerful you might be, there is the need for at least a modicum of moral authority if you want to retain leadership in the world. That Trump is in danger of losing. I agree with Kaplan there. And he perhaps has lost it already.
Hari, if I might ask you about Europe. Europe has a very strong tradition of liberalism, both within Europe and in Europe's projection abroad. Do you think now that this is under tremendous stress with the differences that have arisen between what one might call Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe? The latter seem to have a different code of values at the moment. They don't speak much about values to start with. The Europeans mainly have values articulated by the Nordic countries, by France, but very rarely by Hungary or the Czechs. So do you see this becoming a fissure, a fracture in the European Union?
You know, I'll take this at two levels, the question that you pose. I'll take it partially from a kind of follow-up to the last discussion, the discussion between you and that you initiated with Sugata. The sense that I don't think that any one particular value system is independent of history beyond a certain point. And I think even in the case of the United States, there have been very long periods when the United States has excluded itself from global precincts and has very, very aggressively done so. And I think the 20s and the 30s, as you know, is precisely such a time. There is, therefore, in practically every country or in every region, a diversity of tendencies, and kind of the global tendency which we see enshrined in the Obama presidency, and to a certain degree in the globalization, the Clinton presidency. These reflect one aspect of a particular continuum which exists in the United States, but there are other continuums as well. And I think the same holds true somewhere of Europe. And Europe when it is dealt with as a whole. My own sense is that we have, both in India and in parts of Asia, we have tended to homogenize Europe. And there is a sense that there is one kind of discourse that Europe actually generates. And I have a feeling there is a good reason why in the 1990s this sense of a homogeneity was there, simply because the West dominated the East in Europe during the early stages of the period of the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the end of the Soviet, and I think it was a Soviet empire over Eastern Europe. Okay, you may say it was a benevolent empire, you may quarrel about these issues, but ultimately, if there is any one empire that the Soviet Union had, it was primarily in Eastern Europe. It actually used Eastern Europe for its benefits. So somewhere or another, we go back to a time when Eastern Europe was quiet. But you know, in actually engaging with values, in actually dealing with a country's internal and external policy, very, very important for Eastern Europe, for all the countries of Eastern Europe, to have guidelines through which they would engage with the integration with the EU. Now, at that particular time, you're dealing with a period of international relations. They had to actually formulate terms on which this integration would actually take place, and the integration more globally of the EU within a globalization paradigm. And there, they would actually have to think in terms of the way French, German, Italian, and other values, as articulated in the mid-20th century, would hold good for them. And here I think there came to be problems. In certain cases, in the case of East Germany, there were no problems simply because East Germany's structures were practically liquidated by the West. But essentially in Romania or in Poland or in Hungary, this is not to be the case. You have very, very lively intellectual communities that are actually fought the good fight against the Soviet Union in its own time, and which actually looked to folk traditions and intellectual traditions of the 19th and early 20th century, in which they had, I think, major things to offer. I mean, they engaged with the world during the interwar period on their own terms, independent of the Russian Empire, independent of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the like. And somehow or another, they had a sense that they had something to contribute. The result was that they began, I think, during the mid 2000s and 2010s, to think beyond, say, a Visegrad paradigm in which they simply held together as a bunch of states, and think more in terms of a set of paradigms in which their sovereignty would be more assertive in a lively manner. And that sovereignty is the challenge to the so-called European contribution to Western values. The integrity of Western values, which somehow was there in the 1990s, has disintegrated precisely because after these countries joined the EU, they now need to work out the terms on which they are to actually become standard bearers of those values. Now, so I don't think it's a question of the EU folding up or the EU actually disintegrating or something. I think it is in a process of recreation and transition. But how it is to achieve that recreation and transition, I think very much as in the case of the failures of the Obama and the Clinton presidencies to give large sections of American constituents a kind of reason and an investment in globalization. Very much in that light, we are going through a period in which the so-called Western European paradigm, the Euro-American paradigm, is being transformed and renegotiated. So, in fact, values as such are things which are now receiving a new, if you want to put it in a funny way, a kind of new chronology, a new set of kind of lineages which each of these states is trying to create. But I'd like, in a way, I mean, I'm sorry to turn the tables on you. You know, I think you were a practitioner in many ways of what was going on in this formulation in Europe during the 1990s. I mean, you were present both from the Indian side as well as the London side in what happened during this particular period. And so you know the Europeans on the other side of the fence from literally the ring side. I mean, you were watching the way in which the Commonwealth actually operated when you were handling the Secretariat's business there. And you were dealing with a number of British issues as Britain, as one of the trendsetters within the New Order, actually dealt with these states. Did you not have, I'd like to ask you this question, did you not have a sense that there was a hegemony that was being asserted in this area as far as Western and Eastern Europe was concerned? And, you know, as you were writing this book and as you were editing it, did you not, as it were, begin to think twice about your own experiences as an actor and how far, in fact, even academics had failed, as well as actors to anticipate the problems that were to come? I mean, was there a kind of illusionary period all around in which everybody conspired together in the 1990s to live in a cocoon in which they would not see the problems that were about to happen?
I think, Hari, that if we could anticipate problems which are to come, then the world would be a very different place indeed. So that's a very difficult proposition. Yes, I think that to be very brief and to answer your point, I think that the expansion of the European Union, the continuous expansion that took place from the time the Union was declared in Maastricht to the 27 states which it is now, I think created its own difficulties and tensions, especially since the absorption of the Eastern Central European states was in a way a forced absorption. They did not really have time to adjust to the mores of the European Union before they were incorporated, because the whole dogma at that time was to reach out to the former Soviet Union territories. So the expansion took place helter-skelter, and you can see the problems that take place now in Germany with Eastern Germany. And so I think that it was not anticipated, but it was probably inevitable. But can I just change the optic now a little bit? No, I haven't answered your question about academics and practitioners. Well, there's always a difficulty here when practitioners become academics and vice versa. It's a difficulty particularly in countries like India, where there is a rather formidable gulf between academia and the practitioners. It's much less so, I think, Sugata, in USA. Firstly, because I think that the bureaucracy is much more open to other ideas from outside the bureaucracy. And secondly, because there's a great interchange of personnel. The spoil system in the USA provides for this continuous regeneration, if you like, of the bureaucracy from expertise from outside. I think the Indian government has trifled with this from time to time, but it has not gone as far as it should have, and it's gone probably less effectively than it should have as well. So that gulf, if you can call it suspicion, still continues. But Sugata has been in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Parliament, and he'd be able to tell us more about that, I'm sure. Because the same, I think, applies, Sugata, to the parliamentarians and the bureaucracy.
Yes, I'm an academic who had this wonderful anthropological experience of observing Indian politics at close quarters for 5 years. And throughout that half a decade, I served on the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. We did have to grapple with the question of values and interests. I can give you 2 examples. The draft Constitution Amendment Bill, which would form the basis of the land boundary agreement with Bangladesh, came to us. And I played a very active role in those discussions and the drafting of the report. Now, one of the legacies of colonialism is that we in Asia, and particularly in India, seem to have inherited a unitary conception of sovereignty and also the sense that borders have to be strictly drawn. We have a legacy of an obsession with cartographic anxiety from colonial times. So one of the difficulties that we faced was that we were going to notionally lose a few acres of land if this comprehensive land boundary agreement was to be forged. And for 40 years, the Indira Gandhi Sheikh Mujibur Rahman agreement had not been ratified by India's parliament. So I had to make an argument that it is possible to finely balance the national interest, the state's interests, and also I decided to use the phrase the human interest of the poor people living in those enclaves, that Radcliffe hadn't really dealt with. He was a very bad surgeon when he drew the Radcliffe line in 1947 and left these swabs, which continued to fester. I was able to say that, look, it is in our national interest to have good relations with Bangladesh for a whole variety of reasons. Therefore, we should go forward with it. We need to protect the state's interests, especially if there are going to be financial burdens, in case there's even a limited movement of people. And I still remember telling Sushma Swaraj, who was External Affairs Minister, that please do not send, with all due apologies to you, Chris, please do not send any bureaucrats to Mamata Banerjee, to the Chief Minister of Bengal, because that's exactly what happened. A very fine bureaucrat had been sent by Manmohan Singh, Shiv Shankar Menon, but at the very last moment, the day before a visit was going to be made to Bangladesh. And I discussed the matter with Mamata Banerjee, and people were very surprised when I took the position that I did on the Foreign Affairs Committee. But I had already discussed it with the Chief Minister. It hadn't been discussed, broadly with sort of everyone. So the state's interests were going to be protected. In the operative paragraphs, we were going to make absolutely sure that all of the interests of the neighboring states would be taken care of. But we did talk about values that ultimately it makes absolutely no sense to cling in a dogmatic way to a Westphalian notion of borders and not do something for desperately poor people who have been suffering ever since independence and partition. So I think values did play a part in finally getting this Constitution Amendment Bill through, and we did it unanimously. We were divided on every other issue, but we were able to pass it unanimously.
Sugata, does your view on borders apply also to the India-China border?
Yes, I made the point that if we are not able to resolve the border issue with Bangladesh, then we don't have a hope in hell of making any progress in our negotiations with China, not to mention Pakistan. So let's at least, comprehensively resolve the boundary question with a friendly neighbor, Bangladesh, and that may clear the way towards some real progress with our other bigger and more difficult neighbors. But talking about China, we had many discussions during the Doklam standoff, and at that point, I have to say that we had to focus on interests, national security. We as a committee went to Arunachal Pradesh, we visited Tawang, we went to Nathula, and we presented a report. And I have to say that the members of the opposition showed great restraint and responsibility during that crisis. And we let the government deal with this difficult situation.
Well, that is certainly the sign of a responsible opposition. Can I just, switch to another aspect? Values are supposed to be fundamental, long-lasting, perhaps eternal, universal. But when we come to Japan, Sugata, and Germany, Hari, you find a very rapid U-turn in values as a result of the Second World War. Can you just very briefly tell us how that affected Germany and Sugata, Japan?
Go ahead first, I think.
If you are on the losing side in a world war, then you have to go through a dramatic alteration in values, you might say. But it was the reality of the situation, which I think led Germany and Japan to take an apologetic stance. Unfortunately, I think there were reasons for the victorious powers to have also taken an apologetic stance, which they did not for a very long time. If we are thinking about aggression, if we are considering war crimes, I think the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the greatest crimes committed during the Second World War. And the Allies did not hold back in bombing civilian targets during the Second World War. But it took a Barack Obama, and this happened just a few years ago, to go to Hiroshima and at least express some regret. And that, again, is an example of values playing something of a role in trying to rebalance the United States relationship with Japan and also the whole of Asia. We still don't have an apology for the man-made famine of 1943, for which I think the British colonial state was culpable. So I think that in some ways it was a forced shift in values, but that is what happens. That's the relationship between realpolitik and certain changes in value systems.
Hari, if you don't mind, I've been asked to now request the audience for their views and questions, and I'd be very happy if you are interested enough to ask some challenging questions to our distinguished panelists. I think there should be a mic somewhere.
Yeah, we'll repeat the question.
Okay, could you say what you want to, and then we'll repeat it.
Okay, thank you all the distinguished panelists. I have got two questions. We have had a wonderful discussion. First question is that we have seen the current Indian obsession with Pakistan. Now, is it going to be a we have seen the current obsession of our country with Pakistan. Now, is it going to be a long-term phenomenon or it's a temporary thing? This is number one. Number two is that we have talked a lot about values that differentiates between different countries. So is OBOR or One Belt, One Road, CPEC, like that, is that going to be Asia's answer to Western sense of globalization and modernization? I would love to know your answer, sir. Thank you.
Hari, would you like to pick that up, please?
That gives me an opportunity, really, to take up some issues over here. I think on the Pakistan, both Mr. Srinivasan and Sugata will give you a better answer than I would. I'd just quickly, though, say that sometimes Pakistan is a notion, which is that since you don't want, it is easier to take a small country and to make it the focus of your attention in order to assert your sovereignty and nationalism, rather than take up a large country which has greater substance, which hangs at the back of Pakistan anyway. So I think there are circumstances in which this will not go away. I think this will continuously be somewhere there in the immediate future, as long as sovereignty is an obsession with the Indian state and the way in which it projects itself. Regarding OBOR, this is something which I always find rather an interesting point to kind of remind people about. There are different levels of projection of OBOR by the Chinese state. The PRC, on the one hand, actually projects OBOR as an inclusive Asian project. Okay, and not just Asian, but global in many ways, except that the fine tuning as far as, say, more distant countries and such are concerned is so much the less. But if you actually look at the core documents that are generated within the Academy of Sciences of the Communist Party, and the debates which take place within the Communist Party of China, you will actually see that it's essentially an invitation to the world to learn from China. So that in fact, this is not inclusive in the sense of everybody is simply going to benefit from the money that we are laying out. But everybody is required also to appreciate the way in which we are doing the laying out of the money and where that perspective has originated in terms of Chinese civilization, culture, and development. So China's path is in fact, there is a document on China's path and China's path for the world, which nobody reads, okay? And which Mr. Xi Jinping does not particularly project very far. But it is a very, very powerful aspect of the People's Republic's own self-awareness of the way in which it will persuade its own populations to participate in this, this entire venture. And it is something that has to be remembered as a core component of OBOR. In fact, within the framework of our book, this aspect of China's modern national globalization is something which is frequently understated and underattended. Okay?
Very quickly, we should get over the obsession with Pakistan. India has legitimate ambitions to play a role on the global stage, and we ought not to be hobbled with differences with our neighbor. There should be a concerted effort to resolve matters so that we can play the global role that we aspire to. On OBOR, obviously, India has certain objections based on the sovereignty issue, and that's because one part of the China-Pakistan economic corridor will be going through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. But India also, I think, is committed to building greater connectivity across Asia and the Indian Ocean. And therefore, I think we can come to some kind of an understanding among different Asian countries. Of course, India will focus on relations with Southeast Asia and Japan, and even link up with Japan to establish relationships with Africa. I just want to take this opportunity to make one other statement, that there are certain occasions on which a country can assert values. And I must say that I'm utterly dismayed that on the 70th anniversary of the Indian Republic, our government and our Prime Minister Narendra Modi has chosen to invite Brazil's Bolsonaro. I know something about Bolsonaro. I always discuss Brazilian politics and Indian politics and American politics with my Brazilian colleague in the history department at Harvard, Sidney Shalhoub, and also, of course, with my American colleagues. Here is someone who is a patron of death squads in Brazil. And we had so much choice. This is a world with so many different sovereign countries. And we could not have invited someone with a sense of values on the 70th anniversary of independence of the Republic. I can understand that we have economic interests to protect with Brazil, but that can easily be done through bilateral meetings, that can easily be achieved at BRICS meetings. On a ceremonial occasion, such as the 70th anniversary of the Republic, we ought to have done better, unless it is our objective to show that India is simply part of the global rise of right-wing authoritarianisms.
Thank you. So the United States is losing its role as a global leader on the world stage. So do you think its successor will be able to restore that?
You're speaking of Mr. Trump, perhaps, are you?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
his
He
successor.
created
Well,
a big
I
dent.
think that this is a very speculative question, because it depends on how long one has to wait for a successor of a different mold. Because I asked Sugata earlier about the Trump legacy, and I personally do not know, and I don't think anyone knows, whether Trump has laid down certain markers that are actually going to continue for much longer than Mr. Trump's presidency, whether it's for another 4 years or whether it is just for another few months. Because I think the Trumpism, if you like, in America, I don't think you disagree with this, has a constituency. of a significant number of persons in the USA. He has tapped into a certain mood in the USA, which may continue for really quite some time post-Trumpism. And if that continues, I think it will constitute a different kind of USA altogether. And I think that, as Sugata said, in that case, I think they will inevitably decline in terms of world leadership. Do you have a mic?
Good morning, sir. I had to ask one thing actually. Does the Trump administration's foreign policy just like reflect a bit of George Bush actually, that you are either with them or with us?
George W. Bush.
Yeah, George W. Bush actually. And actually the way the Iran deal was just left by the USA despite all the partners saying to stay, and the way the Paris Climate Agreement was also just torn up and like thrown, and the US just left it in 2017.
I think we've actually really discussed that already, and I think that answer has been given. That Mr. Trump, Sugata, if I may use your words, he wanted really to overturn his democratic predecessors' policies in every possible respect, whether it's climate change or whether it's Iran. Have I got that right?
Yes, and I would say Donald Trump has gone much further than George W. Bush, and I think we've answered that question. And also, I think it's touch and go in the US elections of 2020, because there is about 1/3 of the US electorate that is solidly behind Donald Trump. And as we have seen in our own country, a second term for a democratically elected authoritarian leader can pose much graver dangers than in the first term.
You have the last word.
No, you do, because you're going to answer the question.
I
No,
will try.
Thank
After
you. Thank you. This is delightful.
This is Ambassador Bhagwati,
Thank you. Thank you so much.
an author who's going to present his book at this literary meet.
At 5 o'clock today in the evening. You know, I'm kind of looking back, and I remember one foreign secretary, not for ex-foreign secretary Srinivasan, some other Indian foreign secretary. We were chatting, and I think the Russian president, President Putin, was going to come to Delhi, and we were at the airport to receive him. And there's still some time, so we started talking about values, and he remarked to me that Germany, values we push at multilateral forums. When it comes to core, hardcore national interests, it's all done bilaterally. Now, I'd like a comment on that. But when I look around the world and look at what you mentioned, the bombing of Hiroshima and so on, I'm not entirely sure whether a less, should we say, to the right president would have done this, or a less, in the US context, a president who was more towards the left. We know that Lyndon B. Johnson was a Democratic president, accidental one after JFK was killed, and he's the one who actually ordered that particular landing on that particular beach in Vietnam. So to some extent, I have sympathy with this thing, that its governments always tend to act with regard to interests. And I'll now pose my question: is it civil society and intellectuals, people like you, who then somehow modify or dilute governments which have armies at their disposal, intelligence agencies at their disposal, who are constantly interacting with the political leadership to pursue national interests to the hilt? But it is the rest of the country, and therefore, first condition is that it has to be a democratic country. Otherwise, you know, in dictatorships, civil society in Hitler's Germany couldn't have done much.
Thank you.
Well, governments have power, which they typically wield. I just wish that public intellectuals and civil society had more influence on the behavior of governments.
Yeah, I would like to take this up with a slight twist. I think, in fact, actually, just reflecting on Mr. Trump very quickly, the distinction between him and a Bush is that somewhere or another, a Bush is an extension of a value system. And there was a kind of neoconservatism which was present under the Bush presidency, which is an extension somewhere of things which were there in the 1990s in the global presence of the United States. Mr. Trump is something else. Mr. Trump is a maverick, but there are many mavericks in this pack at the moment. And I think this is very important for all of you to remember, which is that when, and I think Weber put it very well, I mean, ultimately when people have no faith in all the things they're meant to have faith in, they suddenly turn to a person who somewhere seems to indicate all the mood, the ideas, etc., which they would like to stand by, but they have no words to actually develop and kind of find an epitome for. And I think really, when you're dealing with international politics today, somewhere the accident of the 1990s, which actually placed the United States at the center of everything, is now being undone, and people are looking for something else. But unless, and this I think is where Sugata is right, unless, especially in Asia, we begin to assert our alternative senses of how this modern democracy that we have built on our own terms is able to project itself with all its variety, you will simply have a degeneration into worse and worse scenarios of the present, where people are struggling to find alternatives in this world. Somewhere or another, a sense of both language and of a discourse, even if a coherent philosophy is absent, is something that we must work our way towards.
Thank you, Hari. Thank you very much indeed for your patience and for your attention. I'd like you to give a good big hand, please, to Professor Vasudevan, Professor Bose. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivasan, Dr. Vasudevan, and Dr. Bose for a beautiful session. Our next session is Warming Signals, Climate Change and Us. Amitav Ghosh and Dipesh Chakraborty in conversation. This session is brought to you by Shrey. Quick introductions. Sahitya Academy winner and Padma Shri Amitav Ghosh is the first English language writer to be conferred the Gyanpith Award. He's the author of acclaimed books such as The Circle of Reason, Shadow Lines, and we all know the others, most recently Gun Island. His books have been translated into more than 20 languages. Professor Dipesh Chakraborty is an Indian historian with significant contribution to post-colonial theory and subaltern studies. He's the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor in History at the University of Chicago and is the recipient of the 2014 Toynbee Prize that recognizes social scientists for significant academic and public contributions to humanity. The government of West Bengal has awarded Professor Chakraborty a 2019 Tagore Memorial Prize. This session is brought to you by Shrey and is supported by the University of Chicago. Please may I call on stage Amitav Ghosh sir and Professor Chakraborty. We must thank Mr. Ghosh for being here, though he is unwell and he has a long flight afterwards. So, and we have Professor Chakraborty here as well.
How long is the session for?
I think 40 minutes, no?
It's 40 minutes,
জিজ্ঞেস
yeah.
করা যাক? I don't know exactly how long.
It's for 40 minutes, 40 minutes. একটা পর্যন্ত
for about 20 minutes and open it up for 20 minutes or something like that?
Yeah, good idea. So it's till 1 o'clock.
Huh?
Till 1 o'clock.
Till 1 o'clock. Yeah, okay, good. So we're on.
Yep.
Okay, so this is working? Okay, great. Now I need to ask about time because, I'm giving a University of Berkeley is setting up a Center for Tagore Studies, and they've asked me to come and give a lecture inaugurating. But having invited me, and after having having accepted the invitation, they got quite alarmed and wrote back yesterday saying, "Oh, but you're speaking only for 30 minutes." So I said, look, it's always a good idea if you've asked a Bengali intellectual to talk about Tagore, to impose brevity on on the person. Right? So it's good to know that I'm okay. So how do you want to start it, Amitabh? Let me first of all say it's a great pleasure.
It's wonderful to be here with
To be
you,
here
and
with
wonderful to
Amitabh.
be here in this incredible setting.
And so I should say a little bit about how I met Amitabh. I met Amitabh electronically before actually I met him in flesh and blood. I published a book in 2000, and he was good and kind enough to not just read it, but actually write to me. And we had a series of correspondence by email, which eventually got published in an American journal called Journal of Radical History or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
But I enjoyed the exchanges so much, and including our disagreements. And we've since been friends, but then we our paths sometimes accidentally, and with in a very pleasant manner. And we were in Toronto the last time we ran into each other, and the fact that we are both interested in climate change has also brought us together again. So maybe we can start by talking about how we got interested in the issue of climate change, not being scientists and not being policy people.
Well, I think you're being unduly modest, because Dipesh Da's work, especially his first essay on climate change, his fourth thesis, has been an absolutely epochal publication. I mean, environmental humanities is a rapidly growing field, and Dipesh Da's article is regarded as one of the foundational texts. It's been enormously influential, and quite rightly so. I mean, it's influenced all of us in our thinking about these issues. But, I would say really that, to quote Margaret Atwood, climate change is a very inadequate phrase for what is actually happening. What we are seeing around us is really everything change. And I think sometimes when we try to sort of encapsulate a phenomenon within a single phrase like that, it becomes siloed and it becomes kind of diminished in a sense. Whereas I think what we are dealing with today is a much vaster and more important kind of change that enmeshes everything. I mean, it's not so. I don't think the technology or the science. So, the phrase climate change is sort of inextricably tied to technology and science, because scientists and technologists gave, as it were, the public world an understanding of what was going on. But I can tell you certainly that, my interest in this started in about 2000, when I started spending more time in the Sundarbun to write The Hungry Tide. And a fisherman, ordinary people, the women who have to fetch water across long distances, they also understand, perfectly well what is going on. I mean, they see these incredible changes in the world around them. So the first question is really this: why do we treat this phenomenon as something presented to us by scientists and technologists rather than the people who feel the brunt of the changes? And that's obviously because scientists and technologists have access to the world of power. They speak the language of power. The people who are marginalized and who are going to bear the maximum brunt of this, they don't get to talk about it. They don't get to represent, their experience of what is happening in the world.
I mean, I think, in fact, Amitabh is right, and his interest in the environmental issues and environmental questions is older than mine. It's really around 2003. So 3 years after your interest began that I got interested in the subject. And it's, so at one level, I think what Amitav is saying is totally true. First of all, it is, I mean, whether you call it climate change or call it Anthropocene, as one panel will discuss soon, whatever is the name, or global environmental crisis, whatever is the name you give to it, it has multiple dimensions. It's not simply about global warming. It's not simply about the seas becoming acidic. It's not simply about the seas rising. It's not simply about species extinction. It's not simply about us interfering with the nitrogen cycle of the planet or with the carbon cycle of the planet. But it is about all of these things. And sometimes to say that, look, the question is how do we manage societies so that the average rise in the temperature of the surface of the planet is 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. That really is to reduce the problem to a version that nation states, their politicians can at least pretend to be able to address, right? But there's a further history to this. I mean, I was recently in Kottayam at Mahatma Gandhi University, and women there were actually telling me, very much like what you were reporting, Amitav, that not only is the sea rising around that region of coastal India, the seawater is actually coming inland into the country. So water that used to be fresh and sweet is now becoming brackish. So actually, women from poorer families have to go much further to find fresh water with which to cook. So in some ways, climate change is actually being perceived, whatever we call climate change, at everyday level. But before handing it over to Amitav, I want to also say something else, which is that, so this question arises, who knew about climate change and when? So from the science side, the fact that increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would actually raise the temperature of the atmosphere near the surface of the planet. Now, this is a 19th century science, and one person involved in it was a Swedish scientist called Arrhenius, who did experiments in the 1890s. So, but when you go back and read Arrhenius, you will find that Arrhenius was actually very happy to have discovered this because he thought this would lead to more production of food and crops. So for him, it was good news. Exxon, the oil company, because the oil companies employ geologists, actually was finding out about global warming through the geological employees, the geologist employees. And now it's become clear, the Exxon papers have come out, that Exxon at one point was trying to pursue the question of renewable fuel, employed many people, including one of my friends, to work on that project, and then decided that there's still more money to be made out of petroleum, out of fossil fuel, and completely made a secret of their own discovery. So they actually knew about it for much longer than we have known about it. But the other important piece of news, and which coming from a humanities background and coming what in the academic world is called, it might be where I hang out, sometimes described as post-colonial studies. And there's a very interesting factoid that strikes me now as very important. So there's an American scientist called James Hansen, who is regarded as the godfather of climate change science in America, who used to head up an institute called the Goddard Institute of NASA, and who used to be a student of planetary warming on Venus. Because Venus, is a very hot planet. And he knew that the reason why Venus was completely unlivable and so hot was because Venus's atmosphere has a huge share of carbon dioxide. And he also was aware that humans have been putting out more and more carbon dioxide through the use of fossil fuel into the atmosphere. This has been known at least since the Second World War, for interesting reasons that we could get into later, to the governments. So he got interested, he says, in finding out if the same phenomenon was happening on this planet. So he says he took 3 months leave to study this planet. And of course, this has become his vocation and his passion, and he's now almost a evangelical sort of priest of this movement in America. So he made a presentation to the US politicians in 1988 to the American Congress and the Senate, saying, look, this is what's happening. And the elder George Bush is famous for having quipped that I will fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. In other words, saying I'll do nothing. But that was 1988. The next year is when the either that year or the next year is when the UN sets up the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But the same year, one could say, was born, or at least was a very important event happened in the history of post-colonial studies, 1988-99, when Homi Bhabha and Stuart Hall and Isaac Julian, these are all very well-known academic names in the world of post-colonialism, who all came together to create the first conference academic conference on Frantz Fanon, the Martiniquean revolutionary who wrote The Richer of the Earth and all that. And the conference was called the Fact of Blackness, which is the name of a chapter in his book Black Skin, White Masks. If you read people like Homi, Gayatri at that stage, Gayatri Spivak at that stage, and then us in Subaltern Studies, we start writing in 1983, you will find that we have no awareness of this news that has just been broken to American politicians. So there was a peculiar way, no, I'm not saying this is true of Amitabh, there's a peculiar way in which all our academic interests were kind of, if I don't have to be too subtle about it, was environmentally blind. And I got interested in the whole question of climate change was because of part of my life having to do with Australia. And it's very funny, ironical that I've just finished the book. I started working with big Australian fires of 2003, when a lot of the nature spots I loved died. And I asked people, Australia was undergoing a drought, and I kept asking people, is this the normal natural drought that Australia has? And people kept saying, no, it's climate change. And I said, what the hell is climate change? And I began to read up on climate change, and that actually, it completely blew me away when I read the science. And my first instinct, because I'm ultimately deeply a Bengali person, was to write up all my thoughts in Bangla. And once my teacher, mentor, the Ashok Sen, used to edit a journal called Baromash. And I wrote up my first thoughts that Amitabh was referring to in Bangla, actually. And it sank without a trace. My Bengali friend said, oh, egulo bhalo, kintu eigulo amra bhabi na. And another good friend said, eigulo poshchimer byapar, the Westerners are bothered with this. And another Indian friend said to me, just as when we begin to consume and are happy about becoming consumers, you guys come from the West and say, don't consume, while you've had all your consumption for all these hundreds of years. So I was disappointed, and then I went back, and there's an American journal called Critical Inquiry, and I was then on its board, and some of my friends from the journal are here actually in the audience. And there was a point where they were looking for essays, and I think a couple of my friends came and said to me, do you have anything? So I wrote it up in English. And it, like Amita was saying, it got very widely read and discussed and translated, blah, blah, blah. And a question that I would love to discuss is that while globalization, capitalism was everybody's problem, people were discussing, there are Indian academics who've written very good books on globalization. But there are very few Indian academics who've written very good books on global warming. I mean, Amitabh being an exception actually to this, and Amitabh has played a great role in bringing the issue to people's attention. And something I realized is that in a very peculiar way, until perhaps very recently, and I say very, very recently, it has kind of remained a Western problem, even though the idea is that it's everybody's problem. But it's changing. I just came from the Bangla panel where Shishendu Mukhopadhyay was saying that we have, literally, he was saying that we have sucked this world dry, kind of conveying his sense of the time. But anyway, that's how I got interested. But then we, of course, met up. Amitav came to Chicago and gave 3 very brilliant lectures, which eventually formed the basis of his book, The Great Derangement.
It's interesting, Deepesh, that there's so many interesting issues over there. But the first thing I would say is that, it's true what you say, that it was James Hansen and so on who articulated for us the mechanisms whereby climate change is being affected. But the basic reality of it, one can understand a priori. You don't need any science for it. Gandhi understood this perfectly well, exactly 100 years ago, when he said that, if 350 million, at that time there were only 350 million, he said if 350 million Indians consume like Westerners, we'll devour this world like locusts. He understood that perfectly well, and never has this issue been more succinctly put. I think what Shishendu Babu said is also absolutely right. Anybody can see that, you don't need a lot of science to understand this. And in fact, the curious thing is that I think because there is a science attached to it, it also in some weird way enables a kind of denialism. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. And, on many of these questions, Amitav and I play this yes but game, which is the only way that that friendship can actually thrive, right? So yes, in the sense that most of human civilizations in human history have not been as profligate as the civilization has been, as this consumerist capitalist civilization has been since the war, and we have to take some responsibility in that. From that, we now write a history where we say that the Nehru period was terrible, but the Nehru period was actually a period of forced scarcity. We were consuming much less, but the moment liberalization came, most middle classes were happy to consume, first of all. The consumers have grown in number. If we didn't have about the problem of climate change on our minds, then those of you who can, flip your minds back to the 1970s, even Mrs. Gandhi's time. There was a lot of conversation, happy conversation, about the Indian middle class growing and becoming varied, but being united by its consumption basket. And so, in some ways, what happened was, while what Amitav is saying is right, from the 1950s to the 1970s, 80s, 90s, the idea of growth was never seriously challenged, except by people like Gandhi. But you will remember that when the Congress even started doing planning, you will remember that Gandhi's ideas were actually relegated to a thing called Buniyadi planning, foundational thing, basic education. Remember, so even the Congress from 1936-37, when they set up their planning committee, they were paying lip service to Gandhi's ideas. As actually David Lelivel's brother, the Joseph Lelivel, right? The New York Times journalist once said that Gandhi is somebody Indians love to respect and ignore. So he has an iconic importance. So you were totally right. The insight was there, but where you needed, I think, the science is in the realization that you are actually dealing with something much, much bigger than yourselves. So to give you an example, if we lose biodiversity, if there's a serious loss of biodiversity, and suppose you have a great extinction, the history of the planet is such that biodiversity takes few million years to recover. If you destroy soil, it takes about 15,000 years for soil to recover. So what the science has given us is the picture of a very alive planet where many different things come together to create conditions that have sustained complex life. So I'll just give you one quick example, and then again, let Amitav carry on the discussion. You and I and Amitav and everybody and these plants around here, we all depend on oxygen. Oxygen is a very reactive gas. If you just leave oxygen out on its own, oxygen is promiscuous. It will mix up with something and make an oxide of something. So the level of oxygen in the atmosphere has been maintained for a very long time at a level where it's never gone so far that all the forests are burnt out, nor has it ever gone so down that animal life choked to death. And so it means that for many years, we have been able, not us humans, the things around us have been able to keep supplying the atmosphere with fresh oxygen. Who does that? The trees do that. Tiny creatures like planktons do that. There are all kinds of ways the planet produces oxygen. Do you know for how long this atmosphere has been maintained in this condition? We depend on it. Without this atmosphere, we wouldn't live. For 400 million years. So if you screw up, like if global warming goes to, let's say, 6 degrees, one hope it doesn't, some of the planktons might die. And you might be actually shutting off a source of supply of the oxygen. So what I'm saying is, where I personally feel grateful to the science is that the science gives me a new vision of what this planet is. And this science itself is young. It's called Earth System Science. It has a longer history, but NASA set up its first subcommittee on Earth System Science in 1983. And it is planetary science. One of my colleagues had a book called Planetary Science, in which there's a chapter called Planetary Warming. It tells us that there's been warming on this planet long before there were even humans. So there's one very important case of warming that happened on this planet when the temperature went up by 8 degrees Celsius, but it did so over thousands of years. Whereas here, things are happening over a few hundred years. So it's much faster this time. And one way in which people can create climate models, one way in which people can understand the geological behavior, the biogeological chemical behavior of the planet, is actually by studying the records of those old cases of warming on this planet, which are left in the rocks of the planet. And this is one reason why geologists who worked for the oil companies were one of the first group of scientists to report that they were finding in the rocks evidence of global warming before, and what was going on now was something similar to what they were finding. And that's why they were warning companies like Exxon, look, this is what's happening, and of course Exxon ignored it. So, Amitabh, over to you. I was defending the science.
No, there's
without
no,
putting down
there's no need to defend the science. I mean, I completely, I have the greatest respect for scientists, and especially for climate scientists who, in the face of really incredible persecution, especially in America and in Australia and Canada, they've managed to persevere with the work that they do. I mean, I have only the greatest respect for them. But I think what we are actually looking at is that the scientists are messengers. They are just the messengers. They can only tell us what is happening, you know. And in a way, I think the fact that they have become our preferred messengers, rather than farmers whose lands, whose soils are being destroyed, or fishermen whose fish are disappearing, you know, that is, in a way, a real catastrophe. Because politically speaking, I think, you know, it's easy to marginalize scientists, as we've seen in the United States. It's not so easy to marginalize farmers. The other thing is, you know, we live in a world where there's increasing hostility towards expertise. You know, I mean, that's a large part of that is what populism is. It's just hostility to an expert class. Yeah. You know, and scientists are an expert class, and people feel very hostile to them. I mean, for absolutely the wrong reasons. But so, you know, I think it's really very important for us to try and restore the voice of what Ram Guha used to call the ecosystem people, because they're the ones who are in the way. They're the ones who see, you know, what's happening at a grassroots level. And I think it's a problem for us, really, that you know, in a way, we always get caught up in, you know, the science talk and so on. Whereas again, if I may come back to it, I just read a really brilliant manuscript of a book on, again, what was great about this book is that it's not about climate change, it's about everything change. And it frames this entire problem within the framework of the idea of progress. The idea of progress, which actually the first time that progress is articulated as a notion happens in 1750 in France. An economist who, if you ask me, are the people mostly responsible for the madness in the world. An economist, an early economist, actually articulated this idea. And then you can see the way in which this idea just grips the earth, grips human populations in a kind of frenzy. So growth is just one aspect of a general idea of progress. Why is it that people, especially, say, people like me or people like Dipesh or many of us, who would, on the whole, describe ourselves as progressives or would have, why is this message so hard to assimilate? Because it actually shows us that what is happening in the world is the opposite of progress. I mean, we are just hurtling towards disaster.
Yeah, and actually, sitting in this country, it's very hard to say that you can't marginalize farmers, right? Given the farmers' suicide rate and everything.
But they are marginalized.
They are, that's what I'm saying. So, so there is a... see, the difficulty, sometimes I explain it with the example of air conditioning, purchase of air conditioners in Delhi, where poor people are buying air conditioners because the city is becoming so hot. And if you ask them about the results of buying air conditioning, it is a scientific fact that their life chances are improved. People have proved that in Texas, the application of air conditioning actually improved longevity of human beings. And if poor people can buy air conditioning when the city is becoming hot, their well-being improves, their capacity to realize aspirations like prepare for exams without getting bitten by mosquitoes improves, their health improves. But the problem is the city becomes only even hotter. So in a way, when you look at people's aspirations, I mean, I'm talking about city people, they're actually doing a trade-off between the immediate future over which they plan their children's schooling and things, and the long-term future for their own children. It's a very complex problem. I think we should open it up just simply to say that yesterday my colleagues from Chicago and colleague from England and Ahmedabad, and we had a whole day, wonderful day, talking to 400 high school students in the city about climate change. And one question that stayed with me is these children, young people asking, how will we convince our parents to forego the car that they've just bought, to forego their own aspirations? And I feel very optimistic. I think actually children can be very persuasive with their parents, much more so than they think. But maybe we should open it up. I mean,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So, is there a microphone going around? I mean,
There's a question back there. I see a hand.
so we have to moderate as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, sirs. I have two questions. The first question is this. In his book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene,
Roy
Scranton argues that the problem of climate change, among other problems, is insurmountable, mostly because our greatest enemies are ourselves and the currently existing mindsets and the modern ideas, modernity, basically. So, and he proposes that instead of trying to solve our problems with our own ideas, we should learn to die as a civilization. So what is your opinion on this issue?
You want to go first?
Very quickly. So look, there's a tradition in Western philosophy of thinking that the job of philosophy is to teach you how to die.
Yes, sir.
In other words, I mean, you can think of this through Hinduism as well. I mean, Hinduism teaches you how to become old and gracefully. Like the whole idea of Bhavanaprasth, withdrawal. I mean, basically these are philosophies of how to age. So what he's saying is that because he thinks that the civilization is unviable, so he's not saying we will die out. He's saying the civilization will die out because it's not viable. The industrial consumerist civilization we've built. So we should prepare ourselves to witness the death of this civilization and to participate in the process of this civilization dying. In other words, he's saying that's one job that philosophy now has in the West, is to prepare people for the death of this civilization.
Thank you, sir. Another question?
Should you hog? We don't have much time. There are many other hands up. If you don't mind, so we'll go on to other people. If you don't, that's what I would suggest, right? Just in the interest of democracy. Okay, good, thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah, but I noticed you first, so sorry, it's arbitrary. It's really where your eyes go.
Very good afternoon to Amitabh sir and Dipesh sir. Sir, as far I have read your writings, you have been brought up in 3 different places, including India and Bangladesh. So what are the climate changes that you have faced during those times, and how has it degraded during these years and in the coming few years? And what do you think are the possible changes that we can adopt in order to stop it?
Well, as you know, the Bengal Delta is perhaps the most vulnerable part of the whole world.
Yes.
Especially in terms of numbers. I mean, if the whole of the Pacific nation of Tuvalu goes underwater, 10,000 people lose their land. Bhola Island, half of it went down in Bangladesh. 500,000 people were displaced. So just in absolute terms, we are facing such an immense problem, and I think you see it everywhere. This is the strange thing about, what is noticed and what is not noticed. One of the things that strikes me so much in recent years is that if you go to Western India, you'll see that the entire working class of Western India is now people from the East. Bengalis from the Sundarban mainly, but also Jharkhandis, a lot of Assamese, people who just can't find any way to make a living. And we see this turning up when they broke that shanty town in Bangalore. But there are schools in Bangalore where there are now more Bengali speakers than Kannada speakers. There's a huge demographic shift going on inside India that somehow the mainstream media doesn't notice. Nobody notices. This is the extraordinary thing. What I can't get my head around is how blind can you be? I'll give you an example. In 2016, when my book, The Great Derangement, came out, there was an epic drought in central India, especially in Bundelkhand. Hundreds of thousands of farmers were leaving their land every single week, migrating to the city, And Parliament had one discussion of climate change, and less than 10% of the members turned up. So we have to accept that, Roy Scranton, who's a good friend of mine, certainly has put his finger on something, which is that our political systems are not only unprepared for this, they are accelerating our race to extinction, And you compare this, just as an easy comparison, you compare this with the last great climatic anomaly, which was in the 17th century, the Little Ice Age. The Mughals, all the kingdoms in India, the southern kingdoms, the eastern kingdoms, they all understood that they were facing a calamity, and they adapted. They created granaries, they created public distribution systems. So India was less affected, actually, by the Little Ice Age than say, China or Russia. Can you see any signs of adaptation in our political system? The only sign of adaptation you can see is this race towards this kind of populism. And you should not doubt for a moment that too is fundamentally rooted in climate change. Because where does it all come from? In Europe, in America, in India, it starts with migration.
Okay. So my eyes fell on you first. Sorry, so I'll come to you, yeah.
Good afternoon, panel. I wanted to ask you that as you all said that there's a gradual awareness among the educated Bengali middle class about the phenomena of climate change. So simultaneously, do you also find initiatives being taken, or has it remained confined only to the awareness stage?
I mean, becoming aware is always the first step.
Yeah, definitely.
in
But are there
initiative.
initiatives which can maybe lead to productive change?
I'm sure small initiatives are being taken. I don't doubt that for a moment. I can't give you any spectacular examples right at the moment, because you have to realize that our lives, as Amitabh was saying, our lives in India over the last 70 years, but I think in the world over the last 150 years or 200 years, our lives have been locked into this system. And you have to realize that fossil fuels gave us the capacity to increase the number of people on this planet. So human population grew 6 times from 1900 over the 19th century, I mean from 1800. In my lifetime, the population of this country has grown more than 4 times. And we were able, thanks to progress, modernization, to take care of famines, to take care of epidemics and pandemics, which used to be the usual things that depleted human numbers. And until this news broke, we used to think of it as a good thing. So if you read Amartya Sen, you will find that Amartya Sen is always saying there's not a problem feeding people. It's going to be 9 billion. He'd always say there's not a problem, because this climate problem that Amartya Sen talking about, which came from the left field and has upset all these calculations. But now we realize that what fossil fuels are, that what enabled us this as humans is to flourish in a way that humans had never flourished over the last 200 years, right? And so, but our flourishing and our lifestyles are not separated. The flourishing comes out of the hospitals we've built, comes out of the medicines we invent, it comes out of the cars we drive. Shantiniketan could not have been founded without fossil fuel, because the train connection was needed, right? And a steam engine. So there's a peculiar irony I find in this, that actually we have to now learn to be ungrateful for things that we were once very grateful for.
If I may add to that, you said Bengalis, meaning West Bengal Bengalis, and I think that's really part of the problem, that, West Bengal Bengalis, there's too much economics. A very famous economist said to me just a few years ago that, climate is not a big problem, we can solve it if every country becomes like Switzerland.
That is generally the notion among the middle class.
But if I may finish what I'm saying, we have to remember that we are very backward in relation to our neighbors, Bangladesh. Bangladeshis are perhaps the most climate aware population on earth. And they have innumerable kinds of initiatives in Bangladesh, ranging from different kinds of fish production to constant, spreading of the word, to constant spreading of the news. So it's very strange that here we actually, on our side of the border, there's such little awareness of climate change, except amongst these great people who are holding Extinction Rebellion posters. Yes, I think they deserve a hand.
Okay, I think we wind up at 1, right? Yeah. So we just have time for one last question, right? 1 o'clock? Yeah, so I think I'd give it to you, because, again, so keep the question short, please, right? Okay.
There have been several climate agreements signed from the 1990s onwards, sir, but nothing actually seems to work over a period of time, and ultimately we are all left with huge targets, sir. Okay. So is there any particular framework you can suggest if like there can be to handle climate change, whether it be in an international way or between countries, bilateral or in a multilateral forum?
So, I have a friend here from Ahmedabad who is actually a member of the IPCC. She's a scientist. But I can tell you something. Yes. The COP15 agreement, the deal they had in Paris, yes, sir, this had a huge assumption built into it. That the assumption was that if the carbon budgets that were agreed to by this nationally determined contribution scheme, right, where nobody would police you, but if that budget had to be fulfilled, then the assumption was that humans would be able to make emissions negative, not just zero. In other words, we would be able to draw down some of the existing carbon dioxide from atmosphere and sequester it somewhere. The technology doesn't exist. And there was a completely utopian assumption built, and it's on the basis of that utopian assumption that nations could come together and sign off on that agreement. Yeah.
See, you're calling it utopian. I would say it's magical thinking.
Yeah, but same.
And that is why people are right to be skeptical about the expert class, because the expert class indulges in just as much magical thinking.
Expert and politicians.
No,
together.
technocrats, because the COP21 was drawn up by technocrats.
No, but it was negotiated by political.
It was, but it was negotiated in say a closed circle of
But
technocrats, bureaucrats.
But you remember the conversation about 2 degrees Celsius, right?
Yeah.
2 degrees Celsius was a politically agreed figure.
Absolutely.
And I still remember when the British scientists in charge of climate change said to an audience that, look, 2 degrees is the politically accepted figure. And people said to him, we don't want to know what's politically acceptable, tell us what's scientifically acceptable. And what is scientifically acceptable cannot ever be part of these deals, because these deals are political deals. Government signed them. So Navroz is here somewhere, I think, and he knows the story much better than I do, because he was involved on the Indian side. These are political deals, but we can take 2 more questions, I'm told, so we'll stop there. Yeah, please. I've seen 3 people, will make it 3 if you keep the questions brief. Can we take the questions together and then we'll respond to them? Okay. So the gentleman here, and then the lady there, and then the lady there. Yeah.
Thank you, the distinguished panelist, for this wonderful discussion. First of all, when we're talking about the way you are talking about reducing consumption or optimizing it, I should say, should Asia make the sacrifice so that West survives and dominates for more 3 centuries?
Good question. You.
How to sensitize the common people?
Very good question. Amitabh was talking about it. And the third question goes to the young lady there.
So my question is that high school graders, we are all taught about sustainable development from a very young age, but I think it is just too fancy words used in books. I don't see it getting implemented, so I want to know what are the chances in the future. And my another question is that should third world countries, what is the impact of third world countries in climate change? I think big first world countries with more consumers, they should come forward.
That goes back to the first question.
Yeah.
Okay, very quickly, Amitabh will also.
Yeah.
But
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know about schools these days. I met
sir,
only the students, yes. But when I was a student, and my mother used to teach in a Bangla medium school, and one day I suddenly read her, she was a teacher of Bangla literature, and I noticed that she was reading a book on carpentry in Bangla. So I said, Ma, eta porcho keno? Chutor Darpon or whatever the name was. And my mother said, oh, the government has asked us to introduce some practical education, and the headmistress has asked me to teach this. So I said, what do you know about carpentry? He said, no, this is all will be read in a book. There'll be a written exam. They don't have to do any carpentry. Okay. so I hope it's changed now. But just to come back to these other 2 questions very briefly. So the argument from scientists on this question, the first question that was asked, basically they say that there was a time when the crisis still allowed you to engage in a genuine apportioning blame. And their IPCC scientists are saying the crisis is so intense and it's so upon us that we don't have the time to ask even legitimate questions about justice between nations, while the questions remain valid.
See, I think this whole idea of justice and so on, it's curious. Our sort of global expert class, again, constantly talks about justice. They create these economistic models of justice and so on, as though everyone in the world is longing for justice. But if they were longing for justice, there wouldn't have been, slavery. There wouldn't have been imperialism. There wouldn't have been any of these things. And I think this is really my problem with looking at climate change as a techno-scientific issue. I think it's what the situation we are facing today can be traced directly back to the conquest of the Americas and the New World. We're basically seeing exactly the same phenomenon unfold that New World populations saw unfold in the 16th century. We are seeing environmental war. We are seeing a war of extermination. That is what this is. Don't have any doubts about it. IPCC and all are just there to put greenwash over everything. This is literally a war of extermination.
Okay, on that note, we will end the session. Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you.